Okay, so welcome back. Welcome to the last keynote of the conference. It is my pleasure to introduce here Professor Iryna Gurevych. So Iryna is currently a full professor at EU Darmstadt, where she leads the ubiquitous knowledge processing labs. While she works in the area of natural language processing, she has worked in different subtasks and subfields of the NLP in information extraction, natural language understanding, and she over the years accumulated many distinctions and awards in connection to her working in this field. I'm sure many of you are familiar with things coming out from her lab, such as sentence transformers, adapters, resources for argumentation mining. So Iryna currently is also a fellow of the Association for Computational Linguistics. She's also the vice president of the association. She is a fellow of ELIS, the European Lab for Learning, and she is there currently leading or co-directing the NLP program. And recently, Iryna also was awarded with an ERC advanced grant that is going to be studying topics related to modeling cross-document relations. Our talk here today is also going to be touching a bit on this topic. So, Iryna, thanks again for accepting our invitation, and well, let's all welcome the speaker.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. It's my great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. Reading and understanding documents in context is very hard for us humans. And at the same time, collaborative and interactive text work is on the rise. This challenge of modeling text as a living object is a topic of the recent ERC advanced grant project called Intertext. This is what I'm going to introduce in the first part of my talk. So the grant has been awarded in May and has not even started. And I will talk about the vision of this grant. And then in the main part of my talk, I will present some preliminary work that we have done over the recent year in order to prepare this grant and build the foundation for the long-term research project, which I hope will evolve to a big area in NLP. So we read and write documents nowadays together collaboratively in social networks, in school, at work, and of course, as researchers in science. This results in what I personally call the daily collaboration mass. And if you use those tools, you will know perfectly well what I'm talking about. Imagine you write a paper with 5 co-authors. If you're a student or if you're a professor, you write a project proposal with 8 other faculty. And there's this text, and there is feedback coming in different forms about the text. So based on the feedback, the text is updated, and then there is another new text which accumulates the feedback in the revised version, and the process repeats for many times. And after a while, you realize it becomes impossible to keep track of all the feedback and the text, ending in a chaos of changing. So to bring order in this chaos of collaborative text work is where Intertext hopefully is going to help in future building the methods for new tools. So I welcome you to this presentation, a project that looks at text as a living object in context. In Intertext, we model the interaction with text as 3 core types of AI-based assistance. First, we draw interactive links between 2 texts, either 2 revisions of the same text. It's a special case, or another more general case of a comment and a document. This way, one can quickly jump between the text and the feedback. The second type of AI-based assistance is classifying the feedback into different categories. So it's basically a text classification task. For example, you can classify a comment as a to-do or as a question. And third, we compare two texts, for example, two versions of the same text, and create a summary of changes. Or if they are different texts, we create a summary of similarities or summary of differences. And the combination of these three types of AI-based assistance is very powerful, because if we have this, we can answer more complex questions. For example, what is the feedback about, and where the issues raised by the people commenting on the document fixed in a follow-up version, and many other questions of this type. So none of this technology is readily available yet. So we need natural language processing to retrieve the necessary information from the text, the feedback, and the revisions of the text. And as we know, state-of-the-art NLP is based mostly on deep learning, and the pre-trained transformer models have pushed the boundaries in many areas of NLP by a big margin. Yet, if you look at 60 years of history in NLP, it was mostly focused on modeling static and isolated documents. So what we can do very well with transformers, if we have short pieces of text, we can predict their categories, or we look at the structure with text, discourse structure, or named entities, or whatever. So it's focused on a single text. However, to enable this new generation of artificial intelligence for text and multiple document scenarios, we must turn NLP to connected documents that evolve in the context of other documents that we call dynamic text in context. And this is the goal of intertext. So mainly, it is focused on modeling these cross-document relations. This is, of course, very hard, and we will face many challenges that will be solved over the long time of the project. For brevity, I focus on three key challenges from my point of view: the modeling, the representation, and the transfer learning. First, we miss a general model of text structure and cross-document relations. And existing work is built around quite narrow applications, for example, citation classification. But what we envision here is a more generic model that can be applied to any kind of text and a wide variety of possible scenarios. And coming up with such a general model is a great intellectual challenge, because the documents and cross-document relations can be very heterogeneous in nature, and there are like a vast number of possible scenarios and applications. So having something general is a big challenge. For this, we turn to intertextuality. It's a new term for the computer science audience, because this comes from the humanities. This is a theoretical field in literary studies and semiotics dedicated to text in context. And there exists actually not a single intertextuality theory, but like a large number of theories in literary studies where people do theoretical work in modeling relations between different documents. So based on this theory, we want to design a new general graph-based model of cross-document relations and text structure for NLP. And with this model, we create new tasks and benchmarks that cover different domains and applications. So that will be the conceptual foundation of this project. So next comes the representation learning. As mentioned, state-of-the-art is based on transformers, and modern transformers are largely structure agnostic. They work really well with small local contexts, like one or few sentences, and most benchmarks are built around this scenario. But general approaches to use document structure and cross-document links during NLP processing are yet lacking. So there's some initial work that has been recently presenting, but it's not yet large scale and is not really systematically studied due to the lack of data in the first place. Structure is crucial from our point of view to model documents in context. So we will develop new structure-aware representations of texts based on transformers. And we will experiment with novel pre-training strategies, advanced attention, positional embeddings, and many other techniques that incorporate structure in transformers. Last, most domains, tasks, and languages suffer from the lack of training data. So this is well discussed in this conference, for example, for the Portuguese language. And this is a major obstacle because we want to study text as a living object across different domains and applications. So the solution to data scarcity is transfer learning. One of the new approaches to transfer in NLP is adapters, and our lab is one of the major contributors to adapter development. Adapters allow us to train NLP models in one language and apply them to another language, at least for sentence level tasks currently. However, our knowledge beyond that for larger documents, for example, of combining more than 2 adapters is limited. So Intertext will take this research to the next level, and we are going to create new adapter architectures for long and cross-document processing, use adapters for domain and structure transfer, and find optimal ways to combine multiple adapters. So the main outputs of this project will be structure-aware transformers, new adapter architectures to capture the document structure in NLP. And besides, we will introduce novel data sources, contribute novel benchmarks for the community, tools and practical insights into different aspects of cross-document processing. So in the main part of my talk today, I'm going to report on our preliminary work that concerns problem definitions, multi-domain benchmarks, and some initial experiments in modeling and representation learning. So now I turn to the actual research we have carried out here. And this is about the general framework for modeling interconnected texts. And in the first place, it's getting the data for working in this area, so which is a very big challenge. Why is it so? So the first reason, as all of us know, the wild west of data in artificial intelligence is over. And now we have a lot of work and research into ethics and legal points related to artificial intelligence. And the same is in NLP. So in NLP, ethical and legal issues include bias, copyright, how GDPR is dealt with in an experimental setup. And yeah, a lot of NLP research so far, for example, is heavily biased towards a few freely available corpora. For example, we have a huge body of research in Wikipedia. However, unfortunately, a very large number of most real-life application domains remain hardly served. And we do know that the transfer from corpora like Wikipedia to other domains sometimes, or in many cases, fails miserably. So in my point of view, it's a big obstacle for the further development of our field. And if we want to look at these cross-document scenarios, these issues become even much harder than they are for typical one-document scenarios, because texts may come from different sources. For example, you have a mix of Twitter and news, right? So it's not you need to handle a single source, but multiple sources in their interaction. And then texts might be written by different authors, and one or both texts may be private. So because of this, it's not very easy to figure out where to start with in this cross-document processing. So we have discussed that a lot, and then we came up with the idea that it is always good to start with yourself. What I mean by this, we are researchers, and actually we produce a lot of data that is interconnected. So here I took an example from my personal data set. So it's my personal data, and I anonymized that a bit, but it's a communication between program chairs of a recent conference and myself, where the paper is rejected, right? So it's a big deal in our field. We write many papers, and we go through a competitive process, and then we receive those comments about the paper. And of course, in many cases, these comments are absolutely useful and important, and they help us to increase the quality of research. But I think most of you will have had this experience that sometimes you receive comments which may not be very helpful. And this is a big debate in NLP, and I think in other machine learning fields as well, since the field is growing very, very rapidly, and we have many junior reviewers engaged in the reviewing process. And we know that this peer reviewing system is a bit kind of broken, because there's the system is heavily overloaded, and there is very little quality control, what is happening actually in the reviewing. So what to do about it? So our vision, we can use this as one real life application domain where we can create AI-based tools based on studying these cross-document relations. For example, to identify and flag the reviewing flaws and inconsistencies and report those to the area chair. So it's not about automating acceptance decisions, what people frequently think, though we could also provide some assistance in order to make better informed decisions or something like that. And I think there are really like hundreds of potential applications, but just one of them to give you an idea what I'm talking about is analyzing the quality of review. And of course, it requires identifying relations to the underlying paper itself, and maybe also studying the review in the context of rebuttal and summary report of the area chair. So all of this requires modeling the cross-document relations, and therefore we think it's a very good application domain, both from the theoretical point of view, because it fits all of our requirements to study interconnected text. It also allows to study revisions of text, right? Because we also revise a paper very often for the camera ready, for example. And when I was the ACLPC 2018, I was dreaming of a tool that can help me check if the comments of reviewers, the good comments, have been incorporated in the camera-ready version, but it's impossible to check it manually, and we have no support whatsoever, to have quality control of the final papers. So we think this is a great domain, and it's the key to quality control in scientific publishing in general, and it's an excellent source of data because it has papers, reviews, author responses, discussions, revisions, and meta reviews. So in what follows, I'd like to present three novel data sources that we have developed over the last years in order to enable this project looking at cross-document relations. So the first is from the ACL 2018. I already mentioned I was PC chair. So at that time, it's almost 5 years ago. We had the first experiment to collect the data, and then our recent work published in the Computational Linguistics journal is based on an open science F1000 corpus and the ongoing project of collecting reviewing data from the ACL rolling review. And what I'm going to talk about is also many lessons learned along the way. And I think these insights can be important if you work in a completely different domain, but you may encounter similar issues that we have encountered, and we have learned a lot from this process. So I start with the ACL 2018 conference. So at that time, we were pretty naive about collecting data, and the whole ethics debate was also starting in NLP at that time. So we designed a simple agreement form for reviewers and authors where they could tick off a box to contribute their data for research purposes while they were subscribing for the reviewing or they were submitting their paper. And our focus in that study was on reviews and author responses. And we studied the effects of author responses on the score update using NLP. So that was a paper published in NACL, I think 2019, if you are interested in that particular task. So, however, after all the effort of this data collection, when we were thinking of publishing the data and moving forward with the process, we submitted this to the ethical review board, and we found out that while we can do research with this data ourselves, we can't make it public because of several fundamental issues that we did not consider in the process. So strictly speaking, it was criticized that the consent was obtained under pressure during the peer review process. So it was considered to be a high pressure situation if the author is submitting a paper and we asked to fill out this form. So from the ethical point of view, not acceptable. Then at that time, we did not ask people to assign license to this data. And that turns out to be a problem because the license is unclear. So it's unclear what you can or you cannot do with this data. Then the confidentiality. So what happens if a paper is rejected? People consented, we can publish it, but there are unpublished ideas in that work. So we felt uncomfortable about publishing that data set. And also, it turns out there are also some ideas in the reviews we have not think about, but those ideas are also related to the paper. So ethically, it's a critical thing, especially for rejected work. And then there are the GDPR issue. If people decide to withdraw their consent later after we publish the data, so how can we ensure that their data is removed from the derivatives of our data set? No way to do it. So these are the lessons learned. So however, we can still make this data useful to the community. First, not all interesting cross-document tasks are textual. There is plenty of purely numerical data from that data collection that we could release. For example, in peer review, we can build a reviewer paper graph or study how different scores contribute to paper acceptance. This data is available. And of course, we are more interested in text since we come from the NLP. But as I said, this is problematic. One solution to this is similar. So we borrowed this from the medical domain to bring software to the data. So the data remains private, and people submit their software to a particular platform. In this case, we are using the platform called Tira. So that allows people to upload their models, specify which parts of the data they want to access and what they want to predict. And we give them back the results of the evaluation and the numbers. So for more details, you can read the reference paper of Tira, and there is also a human in the loop involved in this platform to manage the experiment. So it's quite a complex setup, but it's feasible. So the problems that we encountered in this ACL 2018 data collection apply in many other scenarios outside of the peer review domain. And generally, as I said, it's hard to find out sources of interconnected texts where all texts are openly available and liberally licensed. So this is actually almost a non-existing case. And in peer review, existing data so far focused on machine learning and NLP, only covering conference style pre-publication review and without a clear license. So that's a limitation of existing research in this area. But peer review is very different across research communities. So in humanities, people have a totally different culture of peer review. So what about those fields? And with the rise of open science and post-publication, peer review becomes very important. So recently we have discovered a new, very interesting source of data that is a source of interconnected text. It's based on post-publication review, that is people submit the paper to this open science platform, and then the reviewers provide comments on those paper, and those comments and the reviews are public. So it's a journal style platform, and it covers many different domains in science, which makes it a very good source, since different to our previous data collection, which is a comparatively narrow domain of science, here we have a comparison across many disciplines. And also a great thing about this corpus is that it's freely licensed. So when we use it in our research, we have a very clear legal situation because there is a clear license attached to this data, both by authors and by the reviewers. And of course, there is more of connected textual data that is not available. And even in peer review, most science is still closed, or people make data open but put no license and don't document it properly, so we can't use it. So instead of waiting, based on the experimental rolling review system of ACL that was started roughly 2 years ago, we decided why not we proceed like in fields as digital mental health, where some personal data is collected from subjects, and we just go ahead and ask the subjects for donation, right? So this is a donation-based approach, and our subjects are basically members of the scientific community. And we learned many lessons from ACL 2018 related to copyright, personal data, and confidentiality. So we spent a lot of time before starting the experiment in talking to all various stakeholders, program chairs, community, doing test runs, obtaining the approval of the highest executive body of ACL, the ACL exec, even because here we deal with really sensitive data, the reviewing data. And we came with a few principles for proactive data collections that I hope are reusable in other fields where you may want to collect the data. So first, no pressure. So the data collection is separated from the process of the peer review. You remember the ethical critic of high pressure situations. So we totally disconnect data collection and the actual activities that authors and reviewers carry out in this platform. Then we give everybody a say. That means authors can block the release of peer reviews, even if the reviewers agreed, because authors indirectly also have some IP to reviews that may rediscuss, for example, some ideas of the paper. And also confidential stays confidential, though it's personally a big pity we are not working with the rejected papers. But we think after a big discussion that well, we should not include rejected papers in a data set, and also we do not publish the identities of authors and contributors unless they explicitly request it. So we applied those principles at the ACL rolling review and designed a workflow for data collection that we call 3S data collection. So for us to collect a data point, 3 things need to be confirmed. So reviewers need to explicitly donate their data in the first step. Then that paper needs to be accepted to a publication to one of the conferences that use the ARR. And authors need to donate their draft and allow us to release the review. So it's a very restricted pipeline. And if one of the boxes is not ticked off, we do nothing about that data point. So it's just discarded from the data collection. So this way, our data collection is ethical, legally correct, and preserves confidentiality. So it's much better than just taking the data. And when this paper was reviewed in a main conference in ACL, we got 3 ethical reviews for this work. We successfully passed this ethical review process along with 3 reviews of the actual research carried out in the paper. So this paper was considered very, very seriously. And I think if we did not have this restrictive process, we would not be able to publish the work. But of course, more steps mean less agreement, and you can clearly see this in the graph. So I have some statistics from ACL 22 and NACL 22 decisions. And the green is the data that we actually get out of the collection. So you can see with each step, it goes down and down. However, despite of this, numerical disadvantage, I still believe our approach is very good because I think we can get more data over time, since ACL rolling review is a continuously running platform. So the data set will grow over time. And second point is, sorry, I forgot the second point. Maybe it comes later to my mind. So apart from the size of the data set that I think is less critical due to growth over time, the problem is also the bias of the data set. So this is what we discovered, and we looked at each step of the process. So if you look at the first step, so the first yes by the reviewers, we cannot see any significant bias. It seems that the reviewers are willing to collect their data independently of the scores they give for the data. But when we apply the next threshold, that is paper acceptance, the data gets skewed towards more positive decisions. And then if the third step is applied, that the authors agree, so it gets even more skewed towards positive decisions. So that's one principal disadvantage of this approach to data collection. And this is, of course, important because now our data collection is totally ethical, but it's also biased, which is a fairness concern. And yeah, so we currently don't have a real solution to this. I think in research, we just need to clearly quantify this bias as compared to an independent data set, and also put the results that we get with this data in the context of the bias that we have. And maybe there are even more biases with the data. We are currently preparing the first data release, and for more distant future, we need to see if the bias is really that bad for NLP. So currently we don't know because the data set is not yet big enough to make this larger judgment. And we also plan to release a set of downstream tasks related to understanding this kind of scientific context, content to the community, to democratize the investigation of the data. So we have some research in mind, but we decided it's ethical to first release the data set and then do our own research with the data, because the data actually belongs to the research community. So we don't want to have a competitive advantage here as opposed to other groups working in this domain. And all of this is implemented in open review. I want to emphasize this point to this multidisciplinary audience in AI. So the code is freely available. So if you were interested to collect such a data set in a different area of AI or machine learning, it's pretty straightforward to reuse our workflow. And we are very happy to help you with this because we are also interested to grow this data. So that's the summary of the data collection. And just to put it into perspective, it took us almost 5 years to build the foundation for the actual thing we want to do in the project, that is to study cross-document relations. So now I come to modeling connected texts. And so far, the limitations of research in this area is that the cross-document tasks are quite isolated and over-specialized. So for example, we have the task of citation contextualization, which is kind of one of the more easier tasks. You have an anchor indicated by the citation, and you need to resolve the reference. However, in a more general formulation, if you don't have the exact span, but you need to find the span as an anchor, the task becomes really very, very hard. And as I already elaborated, we are interested in this more general setup. The other thing is that texts have a lot of structure. I also elaborated that in the beginning. And when we as humans read the document, we consume this structure. For example, we know this is the abstract and this is the conclusion section. So we can navigate among the structural elements. However, the state of the art in NLP is not taking this into account, and transformers are structure agnostic, and the long document processing is still in its infancy. So our major goal is to go from this space of isolated tasks, so people working on Wikipedia revisions and citation contextualization, to a more general framework, which would also allow easy experiments on transfer learning and joint learning of several tasks. And I also explained that theoretically, to design such a framework, we propose to make use of those intertextuality theories from the humanities that come from literary studies, where there exist many theories, but we do not implement any specific theories. What we do instead, we extract the problem dimensions relevant for NLP. So for example, the problem dimension of type, you can have a text about another text, or you can have a text which is an earlier version of another text. So these are two different cases. These are two different relation types. And our solution is to model documents as graphs. So we came up with a model that we call intertextual graph to help us talk about documents, structure, and cross-document relations. We represent each document as a set of nodes and edges, and each node is an element of the document, for example, a paragraph or a section, and a node does not have to be text. We can also store a table or a figure as such a node. We then define three types of relations between nodes: the parent relation, the next edge relation, so that basically reflects the linear reading order in the document. And finally, we have special link edges. Those are the most interesting ones for us because they connect different elements of the document or two different documents. For example, a citation is a link, and a reference to a figure is also a link. So this representation has some good properties. The granularity is flexible. We can work on sentence level or paragraph or section level. We can represent multiple texts at once. We can easily draw relations between different parts of the same document or across different documents. And we also can preserve multimodal data. So with our new typology of cross-document relations and our new data model, we run a large annotation study in the peer reviewing domain. We focus on peer reviews and papers and look into three types of relations. So first, it's the pragmatic tagging, where we analyze structural elements in the review itself. Second, it's the linking that connects a sentence in the review to sentences in the paper. And last, it's a version alignment, which creates a diff between paragraphs in the old and the new paper version. That allows us then to provide answers to questions like, why do reviewers point to the paper? What is the reason behind that? And do the authors updates the paper according to the comments by the reviewers? And I'm going to give you like a brief look into the task of linking, which I think is the most difficult from the three presented tasks. So in linking, we have these explicit links that are easier, like section 2, first paragraph. But we also have much harder links, like the discussion of experiments, which are much harder to model computationally. And we did some annotation studies where we first asked people to identify anchors in one text and targets in the other. So basically 2 spans in the different documents and then link them. And then that turns out to be a very difficult task. So the agreement on that task was not sufficient. So we designed a 2-stage approach. In the first approach, we use some similarity models in order to come up with a ranked list of targets for some given anchors. And in the second step, we use a human annotator in order to classify those suggestions. So it's a suggestion-based annotation model. And we have run an experiment where we have 2 main annotators and 2 domain experts in the domain of the scientific paper being annotated, which is medicine. So we found the agreement between main annotators to be moderate. It's 0.53 in Krippendorf's alpha, which is kind of not bad, but also not good. It's in between. So our hypothesis, of course, was to include domain expertise. So we asked those expert annotators to annotate the same subset of the data. And surprise, surprise, the agreement got worse. So it's counterintuitive. And then we have run another experiment where the experts annotated some texts outside of their expertise. And we found the agreement to be comparable to their actual domain. So the domain expertise does not help in this task. So why is it so? Because the task is very complex. That's why we need a long-term project and we need a large participation from you, from the community, in order to address all of these challenges with our data. We have, for example, unspecific reviewer comments. The overall writing style is good. So it's a document level comment, which is not considered in our task or has alternative splicing profiling being attempted before. So this is also unspecific and cannot be anchored. And then we have what we call unclear target. For example, we have a comment, this data set consists of 160 million reads, each for 16 tissues, each from a different individual. So it's not clear where it is pointing to in the paper. So in future work, we plan to refine our initial task design. And we plan to build it on the intertextuality theory that I've introduced, but we did not use in the initial study. And also we want to develop interactive learning approaches for suggestion methods, because what we used was pretty simple and static. And we are interested to go beyond scientific text, of course, and relate news with scientific literature or blogs and news and different combinations of different types of text. Now, to conclude my talk, I'd like to present just some very initial experiments in structure-aware transformers, where we adapt the representations to include structural information after we have defined the tasks and collected the data. So, of course, that's the most interesting part, but it's a long way yet. So our data model captures the rich structure of many document types. And now the question is how to include this structure. So as I've already mentioned, transformers treat text as a flat sequence of characters in the majority of the current work. And as a result, the information on which parts of the text are headlines and which are regular paragraphs is lost, so it's not considered in document understanding. And the document structure can provide helpful learning signals to solve cross-document tasks. So this is our hypothesis. So for example, the intuition is such that when we want to answer the question, how does the new method perform compared to existing methods based on a research paper, we probably want to give facts presented in the results section of that paper a higher weight. Or when we generate a caption for a figure in the paper, we want to prioritize token from the abstract. So something like that. So, of course, we don't know how to include structure. What is the best possible ways? There are many ways. To begin with, we wanted to test whether a standard long document transformer, the longformer released in 22, has a notion of document structure. So for this, we designed and developed a probing framework. The framework contains a range of document structure related tasks, such as predicting whether one node is the ancestor of another node. And here we see the baseline results for the probing of long-former document structure. And in these experiments, we use the F1000 data set that I've introduced earlier. We introduced two baselines, atomic and random. Atomic means that the longformer receives only the nodes of interest without the document context. And random means that the longformer parameters are reinitialized randomly. So on the left plot, we see absolute accuracy on different probing tasks that we have defined. And it is important to note that while the longformer itself is not trained on the probing tasks, the probing classifier on top of the longformer is trained. So if the task is easy, the probing model might still learn it, even with just one linear layer. In addition, there were a couple of methods proposed to take task complexity into account. So one of them is the minimum description length. You can see on the right part of the slide. And the higher the compression, the easier the probing model learned the task. So this is a good measure to compare different models and baselines on the same task. So we can see in this experiment that most of our probing tasks perform reasonably well, and the full model outperforms the atomic and the random baseline exactly in the order that one would also intuitively expect. And we also looked at the minimum description length, and we see the same pattern. Maybe it is a bit more pronounced. So it is very interesting that many of the structural document features can be predicted based on local context only. This is the atomic baseline. And we think this is because documents are not always very deep, and usually you have sections, subsections, and paragraphs. The scientific writing is pretty standardized, and they have certain keywords. So the model can guess based on the keywords. And then for different probing tasks, there is different room for improvement. So for example, the ancestor task is performing very high, but the sibling task needs more structural information. So the next experiment we did is on the pre-training. The pre-training task here is to predict the two query nodes, which for two query nodes, which one of the other nodes is the lowest common ancestor. So here we compare the out-of-the-box longformer, so this is the blue, and two longformers pre-trained on a special structural pre-training task that I've just explained. And one longformer was pre-trained on Wikipedia data, it is in orange, and the other is on F1000 data, it's in green. We also show the atomic and random baselines from the previous experiment. And the baseline's results are, as expected, being a bit lower than their full model counterparts with the structural pre-training. We see small improvements in terms of absolute accuracy numbers on the left, and the minimum description length numbers show the improvements more clearly for some of the probes. So that shows that the pre-training task works, but the results are not very strong yet. In most cases, we also see that the F1000 pre-trained model is better than the one based on the wiki data. This is expected because the probing is done on the F1000 data. So we can see that some domain transfer is still possible because the results of the wiki pre-trained model are often better than those in the out-of-the-box longformer. We also see that there is still a room for improvement in terms of absolute accuracy number for the most of the probes. And so we plan to improve the pre-training methods in future. So these experiments are just in their infancy. So in future work, we want to incorporate many different structure infusion methods, as mentioned in my vision of the intertext project. And we want to experiment both in single document and cross-document scenario, because the method could also improve the results of common benchmarks by using the structure of the document. And the new benchmarks on cross-document relations will come out of our work later. And we want to add more probing tasks and more pre-training methods. Now I'd like to give you an executive summary and also invite you to collaborate on this in the next year. So first of all, you can already find us online. So that's a brand new website released last week of this project. And the work I've been presenting today is published in several works that you can find here, including the data sets and code. So we still don't have that many papers. But in my lab, there's a big focus on reproducibility. So we want to make it very easy for the community to be involved here. So we provide our intertext graph library that we continuously develop. We provide the corpora as far as it is possible. And also, as I mentioned, if you are interested to collect some data based on open review in your own scientific community, we would be very happy to facilitate this. And with this, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to a hopefully lively discussion.
So, any questions?
Okay, I have a question. Okay, thank you so much for this fantastic, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. It's not my area, but I am really fascinated by it. I was wondering whether what you're finding and your ideas on the text can be extended to dialogue. Because the living aspect of the dialogue and some of the concepts that you mentioned at the beginning, I think they're very salient in dialogue and in interactions. So how do you go from text, this living text, to dialogue?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's actually a great comment. And I can reveal that one of the reviewers on the ERC grant has had this suggestion as well, while finding the project already very dense, in terms of the scope of the work. But he said that this would be perfectly suited to dialogues. And of course, started working on this, because dialogues provide even more structure and you have these interactions between various parties. So this is a very good research direction. And I think another step, and also a question I frequently get, so I can already respond proactively. Of course, this can be put in a multimodal definition, considering different types of data. However, in this project, I think it's just too much, even for an ERC grant, because we want to build those benchmarks, and it's very, very labor intensive. So a lot of resources needs to be spent on this. And I hope we can gain some collaborations during this project to extend it to, other scenarios.
Thank you. Nice talk. Just one question. So when processing the link data that has the form of a graph, does graph embedding play a role? Did you try with graph embedding, and if so, what role does it play?
So I'm sorry, but acoustically, it's not easy to understand the mic. If you could, I just not sure I got the question.
So my question is whether graph embedding techniques play an important role in your analysis of the linked data that results from this benchmark.
Yeah, so they're going to play an important role, but we have not yet implemented this analysis. So this is outstanding, but I mean, we are going to experiment with different types of techniques, with GNNs, of course, that are used, but also with graph transformers. So there's a new family of transformers called graph transformers, but we don't yet have results for this because we are at the stage of building the data and doing some baseline experiments. So yeah, I'm quite looking forward to the results. So we are not dealing with big graphs here, because our graphs usually capture just 2 or a small number of documents, so they are not very large. But other researchers and groups with graph expertise, I think, could do very interesting things, building much larger graphs with citations and author networks and plugging this in. So this is also a case where we are interested in collaboration, because being an NLP group, you know, we don't have this really in-depth graph methods expertise.
So I think I have a question that is kind of related to this last one. So in your talk, you touched on the issue of long document transformers. But in this specific application scenario, we're actually talking about modeling multiple documents. It's more than a single document, right? Because you have interrelations between documents. So I imagine that this becomes even trickier, right? Because now you need to model even longer pieces of text. And there are perhaps also opportunities here in terms of how you change things such as self-attention in order to consider the structure and the fact that you have, well, multiple documents in these sequences that need to be processed, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of your ideas in terms of how this can be handled?
Yeah, I think you already provided some hints in the break, like sparse attention. People are experimenting with this, but definitely, you know, finding efficient methods, processing even longer documents would be an important topic here.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you for the talk. It was very nice. There was a part that I'm not sure if I understood correctly, so I'm going to say what I understood. The question is not right. Yeah, so as far as I understood, so we put ourselves like an inductive bias on. So we put the structure on the text. We put the graph, and then we learn on top of the graph. So my question is whether we could learn the graph itself, so learn the structure of the text instead of putting ourselves in the structure that we think exists, but perhaps may not be the best.
Yeah, so that's very good comment. You know, also a scope of future work and maybe work other people are interested to do. So here the idea is pretty straightforward. The structure is already existing and we use it. But there's work from Stanford, for example. So they use the document links. So they learn the structure basically and use a learned graph. So that's, yeah, the scope of experimentation.
Yeah. So in specific, what I was thinking that I don't like if the section is not called results, it's called some other thing. That's fine for your models. Like when the sections are the vertex, you imagine the author wrote the results and something else, not just results.
Yeah, I mean, it's not learning kind of explicitly the title of the section, but the semantics, you know, of the content related to the given title. And I think, you know, here you will also see significant differences across different domains of research. Since in computer science, the title sections are pretty standard, but in other domains like humanities, they may be very heterogeneous. So this is what we see in our initial experiments, you know, the use of this explicit structure may be helpful or maybe not, depending how much structure you have in the underlying data and how useful this structure is. There is very high variability.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's a very simple question. How about the application domains? For instance, maybe there are some fields that are very difficult to get public data, like business reports. But I see that in others, it might be easy to collect. For instance, have you ever thought of using student assignments like project-based documents and things like that? Something that is somehow different from peer review?
Yeah, so in the project that we are going to conduct now, because all of this is just preliminary feasibility study, if you want to call it like that. So the focus is on different domains. So peer review is just one domain. Another big research direction in my lab is research on misinformation. And in misinformation, you have a lot of social media data, you have news data. And yeah, we have done some analysis. So the sources are few, but there do exist sources, for example, on news with open licenses. And we are currently starting to carry out like annotation experiments in these other discourse types. And it's very challenging because those discourse types, for example, social media is much less standardized. It's much noisier. So we don't know, how good the data will be in the end, but we are working on this since we want really to cover a general scenario of modeling cross-document relations. And we want to release a big benchmark similar to like benchmarks like Lu, for example, that have become standard, for short text classification. And that would require to include different types of documents along with the scientific document, but it's also a challenge to produce it, right? Because we want to have a significant size of the data set, and then you have other challenges, how to scale the annotation, for example. And the question that is also frequently asked about other languages, yeah. So welcome you all on board. We do not speak Portuguese, but we are planning to release all the annotation workflows. So I've been attending a talk in the morning session today. Somebody was using Inception. So Inception comes from our lab, and currently it's extended to be able to annotate cross-document relations in future. So I hope to see many PhD theses in Portugal using this.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank the speaker again. I don't know why lunch will again be served outside.